Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. It kind of sounds like I have my own show, so it's a little bit exciting. So, this is Intro to ESL Instruction, a little mini lecture of what you would have gotten on the regular class, but since we're not meeting officially today, I just thought let me give you the Cliff Notes version of, what we would have gone over in class, maybe discuss some of the differences of the topics today, and then go from there. So, let's get started. So here's some agenda items. We're going to talk about the class topic for today, which is ESL and bilingual education models. I'm going to give you a few class reminders, assignment updates if there are any, and then also just a general update. So ESL as an umbrella. So this week's reading talked about the ESL and also the bilingual education models. Now, when we think ESL, we typically tend to think it's just one type of instruction or just one type of class. We think, oh, it's just to learn English and that's it. But really, in reality, ESL is like the larger part of everything that goes under it. So when I was learning this in my graduate classes, I remember um, drawing an umbrella because this is kind of how I learn. I drew an umbrella. I wrote ESL at the very top, and I also wrote some of the programs underneath. And so that's how I want you to think of it as well. So ESL is the overall umbrella, and under that umbrella, you have different models. So they're all kind of geared at learning a second language. However, they vary depending on effectiveness, depending on resources. There are various models. They all have their pros and cons, and they are established based on resources available and sometimes even, what you know. So whoever is deemed the ESL expert in the building, or maybe they don't have an expert in the building and they choose a model. That's kind of how sometimes this gets chosen. So let's explore some of the different models so that way you're aware. So the ESL models, here's some of the ESL models that I've written down. They're also available in your readings for this week. So let's start with the ESL pullout. So what this is, it is when you have a student who is taken out of class, out of their general mainstream class, and they receive ESL services by a teacher. So typically this is done in a small group setting. Now, some of the pros, it is cost effective because you don't have to hire multiple teachers. Typically there's only one or two ESL teachers in the building and they go around to different classrooms and pull students out. You maximize the number of students serviced. So again, you could have 50 kids who are serviced by one teacher, and that one teacher just kind of takes turns going to different classes, maybe going every other day. It uses fewer ESL teachers. So again, if maybe funding is an issue for that building, that could be covered that way. Now, it also has its cons. It has a limited amount of servicing, so that means that if the teacher's only available to service students Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 45 minutes, then maybe that's the time that the student gets. The student only receives ESL support during pullout time, so they could be going back to the regular ed classroom and receive little to no services, and the student could miss general instruction overall. So whatever they're learning in class at that moment in their mainstream class, that student may be missing that content unless they coordinate with the ESL teacher to maybe learn what they're learning in class, but with some ESL modifications. The second model that I'm going to go over is the ESL push-in. So this is where the student goes to an ESL class for 1 period or 1 hour, or sometimes it's half of the class. And then the pros for this is one class is dedicated to ESL instruction, and then it's with a certified ESL teacher. Some of the cons may be that it's limited to one class, maybe the only class with the ESL support. Now it's very similar to the next model, the sheltered English or content-based programs. This one has a student that has a class that's tailored to ESL and content. So if you've ever gone to any secondary school and you've seen like an ESL social studies or an ESL geometry, that's the kind of class that this is referring to. So some of the pros with this is that the content comes with the ESL instruction. It's modified, it's tailored so the student learns both the content with the ESL support. So you're not only learning, this is what we've talked a lot about in class, you're not only learning the content, but you're also learning language. So the student learns content area with scaffolding support. Some of the cons behind this is that sometimes schools don't give full credit. So maybe it's not worth your 1 credit that you need. Sometimes they're considered remedial classes. So that's like maybe you can take ESL geometry before you can really take geometry without the ESL support. And only one is worth credit. The class availability is based on the teacher's certification. Now, this is something that I have seen in my own working life, is that as much as you want to provide support in all content areas, it really comes down to who is certified in ESL and who is not. So even though I may have 2 teachers who are certified in ESL, but they don't have a content certification, then they can't teach that class. Or vice versa, I could have 2 math teachers who are not certified in ESL, and therefore they're not really equipped to teach an ESL math or an ESL social studies, as much as we want to provide that for our students. So here's some ESL models continued, the structured immersion. The students are in English only class learning a content. The teachers typically have some ESL training. So they could be certified or they could have taken professional development on ESL. Some of the pros is that the students learn the L2 and the teachers may be endorsed in ESL or bilingual ed. Some of the cons, it's limited number of classes due to certificated teachers, limited use of L1 only for instructions. So they definitely are not in favor of translanguaging very much. And then the students are mainstreamed after about 2 years. The next model is submersion. So submersion, this is what I call the sink or swim model. So it's kind of like everyone, is on their own type of deal. So the students are provided support to learn English they're simply put in mainstream classes. So they're provided 0 support. They throw them in a mainstream class and they're like, well, good luck. So some of the pros to this model, if there can be any pros, is that anyone can teach this way. You don't need a certification. You don't need to make any adjustments to your classes if you're the teacher teaching this class. And some of the cons, it definitely puts your students, your EL students, in a sink or swim mode. So you're kind of leaving them to just figure it out for themselves. There are no ESL supports, and it definitely causes some greater harm. It puts students at greater risk to drop out, fall behind academically. So I would only see that students or teachers or schools would do this if maybe it's a smaller district that has 0 experience with EL students, and maybe that's the only thing that they can think of at the time, or maybe it doesn't make sense for them to pay for someone to get ESL certified or pay for a teacher to come in with ESL certification, and maybe that's the only way that I can see that happening. So here's some of the bilingual program models. So I have a lot of experience in this because I've taught in them, and I've been able to go observe different types. So the early exit bilingual program. So this one, it temporarily uses L1 to support L2. And the goal of this program is kind of to get them into an all English program. So hence the early exit. It provides L1 support, which is good. It allocates resources, so that way, if you only need 4 teachers, you only need 4 teachers, and that's it. It keeps classes smaller in size in theory, and some of the cons is that it just pushes kids out really quickly. The students could face possible language loss. They could lose their L1 later on, because if they're only in there for 3 years, then there's no guarantee that students will continue using their L1. And it kind of reminds me of a revolving door. So it just brings kids in and pushes them out, and then brings new kids in and pushes them out. So that's early exit bilingual. Late exit programs, bilingualism and biliteracy, they're both really emphasized. They typically go until 6th grade. Most programs that I am aware of go to 6th grade, but I've seen a few here and there that go to 8th grade. The pros are that, they push bilingualism and biliteracy in L1 and L2. They're appropriately staffed. And then some of the cons, they doesn't go until 12th grade, so they don't really get that full bilingual ed experience. After that, the two-way or the dual language programs. So this is a program that I myself taught in. The students learn content and language in L1 and L2. So it can be done a variety of different ways. You can do half a day in English, half a day in Spanish. You can do half of the students' classes in English, half of the students' classes in Spanish if it's at the secondary level. And some of the pros, the students keep both their L1 and L2. Remember, when you strengthen L1, you also strengthen L2. The content and language, it's both present, so you're learning content and language at the same time. It promotes the bilingualism, biliteracy, and biculturalism, and these tend to be PK-12. So some of the cons, you always have limited staffing. It's hard to find many teachers who are certified in bilingual ed or ESL. Sometimes these programs have long wait lists because they're so popular. And then there's differing models, so not every single dual language program or two-way program is the same. Some you'll find the 50-50 model, which is half day in English, half day in Spanish. Some models you'll find 30% English, 70% Spanish, or 30% Spanish and 70% English. And that's all depending on your staff. Like, do you have people available to teach? And then next we have the heritage languages. So when I was an undergrad, I remember I had a professor who told me, you're not a native speaker, you're a heritage speaker, because I was born in the United States and I spoke Spanish because my parents spoke Spanish. And I remember I was like mind blown. I was like, no, my whole life I've been thinking I'm a native. But in reality, I finally came to my senses and I'm like, okay, I am a heritage speaker because I know the language because of my family, my parents. So indeed, I'm a heritage language speaker of Spanish. So the description of this class is it focuses on building a stronger L1, so it builds up my Spanish. So an example of this class is like a Spanish for Spanish speakers. So some of the pros, it's typically appropriately staffed. You'll have one teacher or two teachers who teach these classes. They can service many students of L1, and then, I'm sorry I got cut off, but it says promote strengthening of L1 and L2. Some of the cons with this is that it's only one class. Sometimes it doesn't have a curriculum, so the teacher's kind of on their own to build as they need, as they see fit, and it's often taught by a foreign language teacher. Nothing against my foreign language teachers. I'm a foreign language teacher myself as well as an ESL teacher, but I mean, you can only do so much. So with all of that said, when it's your turn, either as a teacher, as an advocate, or both, what do you need to consider to implement an appropriate ESL program? So there's a variety of considerations. Remember that when we're talking ESL, and when you're talking ESL with other people, remember that it's not just ESL one class. There's different types of models. Remember that they all have their pros and their cons. They're established based on resources available, and also think what's best for your students. Something to think about when it's your turn to work in a school. We went over that already. What do you need to think about? A few reminders. I think everything we kind of went over. This is the one change that I'm making. Not change, but just clarification. EL Online Notebook due April 14th. But I only want you to think of this as a rough draft, so go ahead and submit only 3 to 5 slides. You don't have to submit the whole completed notebook. The final copy is due April 21st, and I think it reflects that in the modules. So if you need an example of what that looks like, here's a reminder before I get there of when we're meeting via Zoom officially, the 21st and the 28th. It's the longer class. Remember, Jonathan, you're putting together our virtual potluck. Here's an example of that online strategies notebook, what I'm looking for, the title, how it's explained in your own words, how you would apply this in your classroom, and then also a picture of some sort. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this in my next video, and I will give you a moment there.